probably agree on.
Yeah, the playoff team for sure.
So do you.
I mean, I tell you what, I don't think there was a more accurate state. And
if they struggle again, I mean, I don't think there's any way you can keep Alex Critch, but.
What's up, y'all? Bud Elliott here. It's summer school. I want to talk Washington. No better place to go than Dawgman.com. My man, Chris Fetters, covers the defending runner-up for the national title. Chris, welcome back to summer school, dude.
Yeah, thanks a lot, bud. It's summertime, and I have no idea what the heck's going on. It's like, is it really summer? Is it really summer? Because it could be winter, fall. Time in Seattle has stood still since that national championship game. I'm here to tell you, man, because it's like the whole world has been turned upside down.
There are some big expectations to live up to from our listeners, because last year, if you listen to the intro, the guy saying it's not that hard to see Washington making the playoff this year. That's this dude, Chris Fetters. Nobody knows Washington like y'all do, and I really appreciate you coming on. With Kalen DeBoer off to Alabama, Washington goes and they grab Jedd Fisch and a lot of NFL flavor on this coaching staff. What are the most obvious areas in which Washington will look different this year than it looked last year?
Well, in short, bud, they're going to look completely different in almost every single way. Out of the starting 22 that played against Michigan in the national championship game, they have only two returners in linebacker Alfonso Tupatala and cornerback Elijah Jackson. And people will remember nationally Jackson being the one that got the tip at the end of the game against Texas to send Washington to the national championship game. So those are the only two guys that returned out of that national championship game. It's ridiculous. I mean, the offensive line that won the Joe Moore Award, completely gone. Their interior three guys are all off to the SEC. The two tackles are off to the NFL. Obviously, everyone knows where Michael Penix and Rome Odunze and Jalen Polk and Jalen McMillan and all those guys are gone. So the offense is completely gone. Basically, no production coming back in terms of what you saw in 2023. And then defensively, it's going to be completely different because you've obviously got a brand new defensive coordinator in Steve Belichick coming in from the New England Patriots. And then obviously just trying to figure out how many bodies that they needed to bring back in. Jedd Fisch told us at the beginning of this whole thing for him at Washington, they started with 49 scholarship players. And I think right now, if you include all the kids that are coming in the summer at the end of June, I think they'll be up to 84 right now. So I think they still have room for one more guy. But the roster turnover in this thing has been nothing short of remarkable.
Obviously, the style of offense will be somewhat different, but both guys kind of run a pro style, NFL style passing game. With quarterback Will Rogers coming over from Mississippi State, I mean, I think if you look at him under Mike Leach, he was very good. We kind of first guessed what Mississippi State was doing offensively last year, and it ended up being quite the abomination. How do you see him working out in this new Washington pass game?
Well, he gave us a glimpse during, they call it Dogs After Dark, which was basically their spring game. They played it on a Friday night. And, they really showed some things in terms of what they wanted. I mean, obviously every spring game is going to be very vanilla, as you know. I mean, they're just going to show enough. But they showed a pass from Carson Bruner to Jonah Coleman, which I thought was kind of funny. So they still have some humor about it, and they want to throw a little flavor in there every once in a while. But it was very clear that from the start that Will Rogers is the quarterback number one, and it's not even close. I mean, the other guys that were in the competition in spring, at least starting out in spring, were both true freshmen in Damon Williams and DeMarcius Davis. DeMarcius Davis didn't even make it through spring. He's now at UCLA. So it's clear that this offense is going to run right through Will Rogers, and it's going to be timing. It's going to be precision. It's going to be step back and get rid of it as soon as you can. The offensive line is looking like a bit of a jailbreak at this time. It's going to be all brand new. So it's very hard to gauge exactly, even based on spring and what we saw from these guys in the 4 weeks that we saw in practice. And the practices were open to the public, bud. They were open. Everyone got a chance to see it. It was very transparent. Everyone got a real flavor of what it was going to be like. And it's so difficult to know, even with those 15 practices, how that offensive line is going to come together, because they still got offensive linemen coming in June that should be even maybe starters coming in August, at the end of August, because they play August 31st and their starter against Weber State. So there is so much that's unsettled along that front five. It's going to affect everything that happens with what Will Rogers is capable of doing. the people he can find out wide, the new receivers, guys like Denzel Boston, who I thought had a phenomenal spring. The Cal transfer, Jeremiah Hunter, I thought he really came on strong, especially the last couple weeks of spring. And then they've got some of these true freshmen that were coming along, guys like Audric Harris, Jason Robinson, as well as some of the redshirt freshmen like Rashid Williams and Keith Reynolds, who I thought really came along well too. So there's guys that can get it done. Giles Jackson is coming back, the Michigan transfer. He's back for his final season. He's going to be a real leader on that offense. But when it comes to Will Rogers, it's going to be difficult to know because of what that offensive line is going to provide him going forward.
Where, if anywhere, is this team better than it was last year? Or alternatively, which spots do you think will have the smallest drop-off?
Yeah, I think you almost have to talk about it in terms of drop-off now because that offense was so prolific. I mean, it was record-setting for Washington especially. Nationally, I know they were really, really good, but for nationally, it just was different. I mean, Michael Penix led the country in passing, second in the Heisman. We're not going to see that this year with Will Rogers. I don't care how good a season Will Rogers is going to have. He's not going to end up in New York. I think that's pretty safe to assume unless something just absolutely ridiculous happens. And the moon goes sideways or something and something happens with the lunar shift. And I mean, there's something that's going to happen with Mother Nature in a huge way for this to be able to replicate itself at Washington. But in terms of small drop-offs, I think you could see they still have some really good skill guys. The guys that they brought in, I think upwards of 15, 16 guys from Arizona that came with Jedd Fisch. Obviously, it starts with guys like Jonah Coleman, the running back. He brought in a couple of guys. I think Adam Muhammad, honestly, the true freshman running back, he's going to be a guy that people need to watch out for coming this fall. He had a monster spring, came in and acted like he was ready to take a job, which you just don't really see a lot with the true freshman running backs nowadays, at least at Washington. Now, maybe nationally in other places that happens, but that usually doesn't happen up here. Defensively, I think the drop-off is going to be a lot less than what it was last year because as good as the offense was last year, defense wasn't blowing minds. The difference between Michigan and Washington in a national championship game wasn't necessarily the offenses. It was the defenses. Yeah. The Michigan defense was on a whole different level. And I think that's the task that Steve Belichick and the defensive coaches have in terms of getting these guys fundamentally sound and prepared and ready to play a multitude of different offenses. Because obviously, clearly, the offenses you're going to see that were in the Pac-12 last year are going to be different than the offenses you're going to see in the Big Ten this fall. And that even includes the teams they already know with Oregon, USC, and UCLA. So I think defensively, Bud, that's where you're going to see the minimal drop-offs. But offensively, it's going to be night and day.
Which positions could most handle some attrition, like where the depth is best?
Well, the linebacker seems to be pretty strong. I mean, they did lose Adefuano Lufosio to graduation, but they bring back Tupatal, like I said. They bring back Carson Bruner, who I think he had a monster spring. He's ready to break out. They have one of the freshmen in Devin Bryant, who was hurt this spring, but I think he could come back and do something special this fall. I think he's got a chance. They brought in Brian Parham from San Jose State. He sort of slotted in pretty well as far as that goes. And Kamori House, the true freshman for Bosco, I thought he had a really strong spring for a true freshman. So they've got some bodies there. They bring in Hayden Moore, the kid from Michigan, who is coming in June. I know he didn't do anything when he was at Michigan, but he's got a chance. He's from Denver, pretty highly rated kid. So I think, they've got some bodies there. Not so much that they could use some attrition, but I think there's going to be a situation where they're going to be at least 2 or 3 deep and have some quality there. So I think linebacker, they're in pretty good shape right now. And then with defensive back, they brought in a ton of bodies. Ephesians Prysock is probably the best known of the transfers from Arizona. 6'4", you can't miss him. And then they're bringing in a couple safeties in the summer in Oklahoma's Justin Harrington, and then Cam Broussard from Sac State, a guy that I think a little bit of a late feeding frenzy, but then he committed to Washington after an official visit. I think he's a guy that could provide some depth, and it's clear Belichick wants to get as many defensive backs into the rotation as possible because he wants to run that base nickel, even try some dime at times and really rotate some guys and try to instill some pressures and things like that. Because when we really kind of broke down what he wanted to do in New England, it was to be really fundamentally sound, be disciplined, but then also kind of cause a lot of havoc at the defensive line. And so he was able to do that a little bit. And again, I'm still not sure whether that was because the defensive line was doing a good job or whether it was because the offensive line just wasn't what we expect it's going to be this fall. But I'd say linebacker, defensive line, basically the defensive general will look pretty good. But I'd say linebacker, defensive backfield, secondary probably are the places that have the most talent right now and could probably suffer a little bit of attrition.
I was listening to some NFL draft podcasts in the run-up to the draft, and I suspect that Washington may have got a sneaky good get in Steve Belichick. It's as much as it's possible to be sneaky good if your last name is Belichick. But they were making the argument that New England was maybe the least talented team outside of Carolina in the NFL, and that Steve Belichick and Bill were working miracles with that defense to get it to play as well as it was, because it actually was maybe not all that talented. And like that maybe New England shouldn't draft Drake May because they're not going to be ready to have enough pieces around him during his rookie deal, which I was like, wow, that's kind of shocking. But also, damn, if that's true, like nice job, Steve Belichick, working with his dad there at New England. I don't really have a question. It kind of popped in my mind and figured we just bring that up. So no Ohio State on this schedule in Washington's first foray into the Big Ten, but then they do get, at least in my power ratings, teams 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 from the Big Ten. So not a lot of breaks there in terms of the upper half of the conference. What needs to happen for Washington to avoid a TCU situation where they just fall off after being the national runner-up and miss a bowl?
Well, again, not to harp on the negative, but it is the offensive line's got to become what Brennan Carroll needs them to be, which is to provide Will Rogers enough time to get the ball to his playmakers. And it's because the defense, again, I think if the defense simply just makes slight improvements from last year, they were already decent enough to make it to the national championship game with obviously a huge helping from the offense. I mean, like a record-breaking offense. But the offense still, Jed Fish, that's what he hangs his hat on. He's an offensive guy, quarterback coach, offensive coordinator. He's going to run that Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan style of pro style attack, where they're gonna try to maybe run some wide zones and open up some play actions that way. But they can also run gap schemes. They can do a number of different things, and they can be as multiple as they need to be in order to maximize the personnel they have. So again, as many things as I'll talk about, Bud, in terms of the differences that they have to deal with in 2024, Washington can be okay offensively. They can put up points because they have the coaches in place to scheme and to take advantage of the talent that they do have. Now, it's interesting because you mentioned the scheduling, and you're right. I don't think necessarily they got any favors other than missing Ohio State. The Michigan game where Michigan comes to Seattle, it's going to be so crazy because that game would be the game of that weekend. It would be the redo of the national championship game. Yet it's not going to be anywhere close to anybody on either side of that team or other side of that game where the teams are going to be like they were in the national championship game. They are wholly and completely different. The only things that are going to be similar is that they're wearing the same uniforms, but the guys inside the uniforms none of them played in that game. So that's going to be really unusual. And then obviously playing the Oregon game in the slot where they would normally play Washington State in the Apple Cup and that Thanksgiving weekend is going to be really, really strange too. Because for all intents and purposes, even though Washington does play Washington State in September, which again is so crazy, the fact that basically Oregon has taken the place as Washington's now natural rival, which if you talk to most Washington fans now would have said that that's already happened because the Washington State hasn't really done much against Washington in the last 10, 15, 20 years, what have you. They've won the occasional game here and there, but realistically, it hasn't been much of a rivalry the last couple decades. Whereas the one against Oregon, I think everyone knows nationally, that's become one of the real hate fests. I mean, that has legitimate beef. I mean, when it comes to those two teams. So it's going to be a hell of a matchup. I'm really looking forward, honestly. When I was a kid and we were talking about, trips to Happy Valley or trips to Iowa and things like these are things that we only thought about as non-conference things because growing up in the era when going to the Rose Bowl was everything, and you had those Don James Hayden Fry matchups back in the day with Iowa and all that and the Rose Bowl, and it was like, yeah, that would be so great to have like a non-conference matchup, and you could go to Iowa and check all that. And now with the thing that they do with the Children's Hospital and all that, I'm absolutely blown away at how cool some of these road trips are going to be for the Washington fans moving forward. So looking forward to that schedule quite a bit, even though, as you said, really not a lot of favors.
Chris, I really appreciate your candor as well as far as the unknowables of this team, right? Like last year came on, had a really, really good feel for what this team will be. But to your point, with so many likely important players arriving over the summer, it's hard to pin down exactly what this team will be. I use like a little bit of a variance rating in my projections, and I literally have 4-8 to 9-3, all as like actual outcomes that could happen with this team, which that's normally not that wide, right? 4-8 to 9-3 is a crazy potential band there. But I'm so excited to watch this team. I do think Jed Fish was a nice, very nice get for them at head coach, and it's one of the bigger turnover situations that we've seen, both roster and coaching staff.
Yeah, and to square the circle for you, someone asked for my very, very early prediction on what my season record is going to be, and I have 6-6.
See,
so I mean it's literally about as much as I can equivocate in terms of what I know versus what I don't know. What's really, really interesting about this stuff, Bud, is that Fish has really, really leaned in hard to his NFL pedigree. And, bringing in Brendan Carroll, who has obviously an NFL pedigree with his dad, bringing in Steve Belichick, who clearly has an NFL pedigree with his father, harping on it. Both Bill Belichick and Pete Carroll have been at practice in the spring. He brought in Jack Del Rio because his son is on the staff. There is so much about the NFL and about becoming a pro in this program right now. I mean, it just reeks of the NFL in a really good way. I mean, there's a palpable stench. I mean, it really is. If you want to be developed and make it to the next level, you come to Washington. If you listen to Jed Fish, you look at all of his guys with all his pro pedigrees, what they're trying to run offensively, defensively, pro style attacks, pro schemes, and all of that. What's really interesting is that when you start boiling down all the new players that are going to be coming in June and whatnot, it feels almost like a mini camp style environment. You're bringing in brand new guys, but again, instead of drafting them, you're trying to get them through NIL. You're trying to get them on campus. You're trying to get a feel for them, but you're really almost doing it in some ways like the NFL spends so much money with doing their due diligence. This feels like you're almost doing it with one eye closed in some ways. And then they had a couple guys where they had them on campus, they had them committed, and especially a couple of the offensive linemen, and they end up going other places. You think you have them locked down, and then the NIL battle begins, and now all of a sudden you're back to square one. So there's so many things going on with what's happening in Washington, and trust me, I'm not trying to act like what's happening in Washington is whole and totally new compared to everyone else in America, because this is happening all across the country, coast to coast. I mean, every program's dealing with this stuff. But when you add the coaching change to it and the roster turnover that comes as a result of it, like I was looking at some of the transfer portal stuff in terms of the ratings and rankings, and it's very easy to tell who the teams are that had new coaches as opposed to those who didn't. Those who didn't only had maybe 7, 8, upwards of 10 portal guys coming in and out. The guys like Michigan State, Indiana, Washington, they had 25 to 30 guys minimum. And you add that to the guys that already signed back in mid-December, all those other things. Now you're starting to talk about roster turnover that, like, I looked at Indiana's over 45. I think Washington's close to 45. It's so different than what it was just a couple of years ago, and that it almost feels like a completely different game.
I have started to sort of look at the transfer portal through different lenses for different purposes, right?
Yeah.
How are you logically going to rank classes where one team takes 6 and another team takes 40? So I sort of started looking at it through all right, playoff contender lens. Like I'm judging all these classes from like, would a playoff contender take these guys, right? And then hey, can we be a top third of Power 5, type of team? Like, look, how useful is this crop of commits to a team trying to be in that sort of like, top 20, top 30 level of power rating, and then maybe like upper G5, bottom of the barrel P4 type stuff. And I think if you do that, it comes into relief a little bit, but that's not really, you can't really do that on a website. You know what I mean? So it's very, very tough.
You also get a great sense, Bud, of where you really live in the food chain, in the college football food chain. Alabama, they pick who they want.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Washington is now in the position where they got to pick someone. So they pick someone from Arizona. Arizona's like, okay, well, we're a little lower on the food chain. Who do they go grab? Well, they go grab Brent Brennan from San Jose State. So they're a little, and it just, you can see the literal, I mean, it's a physical and literal progression from the top down through the bottom of the food chain. And there's so much collateral damage that comes with every head coaching decision, because now you're talking about assistant coaches and their families. And now you're talking about recruits and their families. And there's literally the decision of Kalen DeBoer to move from Washington to Alabama probably had repercussions and ripple effects that affected thousands of people.
Yeah.
It's amazing to if you really look at how this thing worked itself away down the food chain, like Arizona fans, I mean, they want to hang Jed Fish in effigy right now.
Sure.
I mean, they really feel like he did them massively dirty. And I can see it, because it's not just Jed Fish leaving, it's all the assistants leaving. It's Washington took 15 or 16 of their kids. Wow. But like I said, you get a great snapshot of exactly where you're living. Okay, do you have the worst house on the best block? Mm-hmm. Or do you have the best house on the worst block? Or are you somewhere in between?
That's really good. And we always saw it with coaching, but we didn't always see, but now the new piece is the players following as well, right? And so like that instant feedback is jarring in many ways.
Well, and now again, there's another piece, an additional piece when we're talking about the NFL and talking about all of those things. You're looking at Alabama taking DeBoer takes his coaches, and now all of a sudden you're looking at Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff saying, you know what? If Seattle comes calling, the Seahawks come calling, yeah, I'm going to take a listen to them. So they were actually on the road. They were recruiting. They were doing stuff for Alabama for a few weeks. And now all of a sudden the Seahawks make their decision. They hire their head coach, and their head coach is like, hey, I like what Washington did offensively, man. I want to get that offensive coordinator. I want to get that offensive line coach. And they're like, wait, that means we don't really have to leave Seattle? We were just on a few-week vacation down in Tuscaloosa. It's all good. They're like, yeah, you'll get paid more, and you get everything, and you don't have to really worry about recruiting anymore. We just do all that for you. And it's like, wait a second, is this for real? And so now you're displacing other families because of all this stuff that happened. And now all the players like Parker Brailsford, wonderful kid, great family, he was destined to have a monster career at Washington. I mean, as a redshirt freshman, he went in, started at right guard, moved to center when Mateo Mele got hurt, started that whole rest of the season last year, made it to the national championship game. He's off to Alabama because he thinks he's going to be coached by the guy that coached him at Washington. Not so fast. This is why it's so funny. The more things change, Bud, the more things stay the same, because you always still tell kids in recruiting, don't go somewhere because of a coach, because you can't control what they're going to do. You can only control what you're going to do. So you better be sure that you're going to a school because you like the academics, you like the social situation, you like all the things that are going on off the field, and in many ways taking football out of the equation to figure out what school you want to go to almost makes as much sense now as it did before, because before it was all like, well, I just want to see what program gets me to the league fastest. Well, now NIL is a big equalizer in that format. You're getting paid. If you're getting paid now, it's like, we already know only 5% of those guys ever make it to the NFL to begin with. Right. So if you're not thinking about your future anyways, you've already messed up. And so it is funny how the more things have changed in these last few years, and the more variables you add into it, the more you still kind of go back to the very beginning and the fundamental things that have always kind of determined where you should be looking at when you want to go to a school, because it really fundamentally those things haven't changed.
You said it, man. We're going to be looking forward to Dawgman.com for all your coverage, because there's a lot we still need to learn about this football team. And I'm excited to watch Washington as they enter their maiden voyage into the Big Ten. Chris, I appreciate the time, man.
I appreciate it, bud. Thank you.